You have called to us the life of faith. You have called to us the life of faith.
O Lord, our gracious God, we thank you that in every generation, in every situation, in every locale, you have preserved your church. Despite every obstacle, despite the difficulties that your people faced, you have continued through your Holy Spirit to empower them and to use them to be and to enact the work of the church. We thank you for the faithful souls that you brought to Hutchinson to begin this congregation, and for their heritage that we now are privileged to enjoy, to be blessed by all these many years later. And we pray, Lord, that as we hear of their story, that you would equip us with courage and faith, with persistence and commitment to carry this ministry forward by your grace and power into the next 150 years. All these things, Lord, we pray in the name of your Son, our Savior, Jesus Christ. Amen. Well, last session we explored the coming of Danish Christians to America in a very broad sense. It was a slow start just because there weren't all that many Danes who came to America. They were a small group, relatively, of immigrants. And there was very little support coming from the Church of Denmark. They just didn't show that much interest or concern for the immigrants who had come here. But there were people here whom God raised up to make sure that the word was heard and the sacraments administered. So we talked about how Klaus Clausen formed the Conference for the Norwegian Danish Lutheran Church in 1870, known more felicitously as the Norwegian Danish Conference, or sometimes just the Conference as you're reading these sources. 4 years later, there were those 4 pastors, 2 missionaries, 2 lay pastors who'd been ordained in this country, that formed the Danish Lutheran Church in America, much more popularly known as the Danish Church, which is interesting because there were other Danish churches. They just sort of took the name, the Danish Church. The denomination that Faith Lutheran Church was originally part of formed out of 2 church splits. The Norwegian Danish Conference eventually split ethnically. And the Danes then formed what was called the Blair Church in 1884. Then a few years later, the intermission Danes broke away from the Danish Church because it was increasingly influenced by Grundtvig and his teaching. And the intermission folks had some real problems with that. And so they formed the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in North America, which was known by the name of the North Church. And then those 2 merged just 2 years after the North Church was formed in 1896 to form the United Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, or the United Church. And this is the denomination that Faith was a part of until it ended in 1960 and merged into what was then called the American Lutheran Church. Now, I noted last week how confusing the similarity of these names are. It's just one combination of Danish Lutheran America Church, evangelical, over and over and over again. And that's frankly why they mostly use nicknames for them. The North Church, the Blair Church, the United Church, because it was just too hard to keep them straight otherwise. Well, if all of those variety of names confused you, don't feel bad. Because I discovered this week the same confusion actually lies in Faith Lutheran's own history. In our 125th anniversary book, we have a few copies of this around. It's a treasure, and it's sort of the basis for the new history book that Sharon and some others are working on. Loanne, I think, is part of that too. That 120th anniversary book says in 1885, the congregation joined the United Evangelical Lutheran Church Synod. Well, I read that and said, that can't be right. because the United Church wasn't formed until 1896. So, I mean, it's 9 years too soon for them to be a part of the United Church. It just isn't possible. It also mentions that during this time, Main Street Lutheran was getting pastors from the conference, the Norwegian-Danish Conference. But that started way back in 1870. So why would Faith Lutheran or Main Street Lutheran only join in 1885? That, didn't really make sense either. Well, Sharon has done a lot of detective work out at the McLeod County Historical Society, and she found this newspaper article that was written at the time that our current sanctuary was dedicated. It got a lot of ink in the local papers. But this little historical sketch was written by Pastor H.A. Svensson, who was at the time the pastor here at Main Street Lutheran. Well, he says that the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, which the congregation joined in 1885. But that can't be right either, because that's the Church of the Happy Danes. And whatever else we did around here, we didn't muck around with the Happy Danes. That just, we were much too pious and holy and serious for that. So what in the world's going on? I'm thinking, what church body did Faith or Main Street Lutheran actually join in 1885? Well, I finally went back to that book by Paul C. Nyholm to try to track this down. And I discovered that there's yet another church name that I omitted last week. Left out. I'm sure you're all deeply disappointed. But it turns out that the Blair Church, and I should have known this just by looking at it, that's also a nickname. That was never an official name. The official name was the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church Association in America. This was the intermission church that was formed in Argo, Nebraska in 1884. And the year later, then, Main Street Lutheran joined with these other intermission Danes in this church that broke out of the Norwegian-Danish Conference. So, and this was the church then that merged with the North Church to form the United Church then in 1896. But back in 1885, when Main Street Lutheran joined, it was this Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church Association in America. It was just known by the nickname of the Blair Church. So I finally realized that what happened in that article, the book just was a little anachronistic. They were ahead of their time. But in Svensson's article, he just left out that keyword association. But by not having that in there, it made it sound like we had joined the Church of the Happy Danes, which just did not seem possible. And in fact, it wasn't possible. That would not have happened. If he had just said the Blair Church, it all would have been perfectly clear. But he used what he thought was an official name, but there was one key word missing. Well, I can imagine even he was confused by all these very similar sounding names, and to leave out one of these words was really easy. But it did create this kind of mystery for a little while. It's like, what church body did Faith actually join? Well, it was the Blair Church, not the Danish church, but it's because of this name that was officially on it, but the word association got left out. So, Faith Lutheran did always belong to intermission churches. No Grundtvigians around here. But if, by now your heads are spinning, we'll come back to this and Faith's context a little bit later on. Well, it wasn't only Danes, but really all immigrants who came to the United States, whether from Europe or Asia, even Africa, they tended to gather in ethnic enclaves. Danes came to where there were other Danes. Norwegians came to where there were other Norwegians. Now, in the early 1800s, most of the Danes who came here settled in eastern seaboard cities. New York City, other places along, especially the northeastern coast of the United States. That's where the boats landed. Why go any further? People all over the place. Plus, of course, many of the Danes were seafaring people. Denmark is this little thumbprint sticking up into the North Sea, so they're familiar with the ocean. And so many of these Danish men found employment in the shipping industry there. But as more immigrants came, they tended to move further inland and began coming to the Midwest by about the middle of the 19th century. And in fact, some of them went a lot further than that. In the 1920 census of the U.S., you might be surprised, the state with the most Danish immigrants?
Nevada.
California. California, of all places. And actually, if you've traveled to California, there's a little town called Solvang that is profoundly Danish, has maintained that heritage. It still feels like a little Danish village there. Beautiful little town, yep. As of the 2000 census, California still had the most residents of Danish heritage. Not all immigrants, of course, anymore. But so that's where a lot of them ended up. Back in that 1920 census, though, Minnesota had the 4th most Danish immigrants. And I just found it curious as I'm reading these sources, including from the Danish American Museum down in Elkhorn, Iowa. You'd swear that Wisconsin was Denmark Central here. But Minnesota had more Danish immigrants than Wisconsin did. But somehow they had that reputation from Racine and Luck and West Denmark and whatnot that they had more of the Danish immigrants. Well, these Danes first came to Hutchinson in 1867. So 3 years before Faith Lutheran Church was founded. They were guided here by one M.C. Pedersen, who actually lived in West Denmark, Wisconsin. And after getting the little group kind of settled here, he went back to West Denmark, Wisconsin. So he was just sort of a guide to get them planted here. I have not found any explanation of why they came all the way to Hutchinson. I was reading an old history of McLeod County that gives these dates. It even lists the names of those who came, but nothing of the backstory. Why here? Of all the places they could have landed. There were about 20 adults and children in this group that came and settled around Hutchinson. But of course, once you had some Danes settled here, then more came to join them. It becomes one of those points on the map you look toward as a Danish immigrant. Now, the history of Faith Lutheran says that the founders of the church, having just arrived from Jylland, Denmark, in 1870. And again, I can't find any more of the backstory than that, but I found this in a number of places, having just arrived. So that suggests that they were a different group than that 20 or so that came in 1867. It was a second wave of immigrants, or maybe a third or a fourth, I don't know, but not part of that first group. It's also interesting that, as far as we know, the 1867 group did not make any effort to start a church. Whereas it sounds as if this group was barely off the boat, and that's the first thing they got around to was starting a church. Were there different faith priorities? We've talked about the sad truth that about 75% of the Danes had no church connection in this country. Was that the case here between these first two groups that came? Honestly, there isn't enough of a record to tell. You're dealing with precious little information and actually a lot of speculation. So I don't know, but it is curious that we did have this pioneering group of Danes 3 years before the group that founded Faith Lutheran. But everything says that the group that founded Faith Lutheran had just arrived in Hutchinson. Well, in 1870, 6 families of recent immigrants got together to form a church. And in typical fashion, they called it the Hutchinson Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church. Again, they didn't like short names, unless they were nicknames. The official names were always very long. And perhaps because of that, or just the general confusion, it was also known as the Danish Evangelical Lutheran Association, which makes me wonder if that comes from the denomination that was formed in 1884 with that word association. But by the early 1900s, of course, it became widely and affectionately known as Main Street Lutheran. And these are a couple of our heritage artifacts. We have here a plate, which used to be so common to do plates of churches, or our old china was all imprinted with the name of Main Street Lutheran on it. You can see these things down in the cabinets in the gathering space if you want to take a closer look at them. But what's really curious is that none of these names were ever officially recorded with the state. No articles of incorporation were ever filed. So in a sense, all these names were unofficial. And particularly Main Street Lutheran appears to have been nothing more than a nickname, because people couldn't remember to say Hutchinson, Danish Evangelical Lutheran Church Association in America, whatever. It was just, well, it's on Main Street Lutheran. But that name had no legal status. And in 2009, when we were in the process of building this building, you maybe know that over several decades, Faith Lutheran just slowly bought up one lot after another on this block. So as we were preparing to build this building, we were going to close the alley, and the city said, you know, you should really unify all those lots into one parcel. So we went about doing that, or the lawyers went about doing that. Come to find out that some of those lots had been purchased in the name of Main Street Lutheran Church, which was a legal fiction. Legally, it didn't exist. So an organization that had no legal reality to it was on the deeds as having purchased this property. And so to figure all that out and get this unified into one parcel that was actually legally recorded kept a couple of lawyers gainfully employed for a while. It was a bit of a challenge. Now, the name of the church was officially changed to Faith Lutheran in 1958. And part of that was a reaction to discovering that none of these other names were ever filed. But they didn't check on the property. That didn't happen until 2009, that we figured all of that out. Well, at the start, Faith Lutheran was associated with the Norwegian-Danish Conference. That's where whatever pastoral leadership they had came from. They were conference pastors. They met in private homes, or for a while in a country school. They didn't have any building, of course, any church building. The first pastor who served them was a man named T.H. Dahl. I haven't been able to find any picture of him. And of course, this was only part-time. He was like a circuit rider. So it's, you know, whenever he would come into town, they would have a service. But it wasn't week in and week out. There weren't pastors available to do that. They were also served by some students from Augsburg Seminary, where Augsburg College is now. That was founded by the Norwegian-Danish Conference. And so as they trained pastors on weekends, they would come out and serve churches like Main Street Lutheran. Well, by 1882, 1883, in that area, so you know, a decade, a little more after starting, the church had grown to 30 families, and so a building was needed. They couldn't fit anywhere else. It was time to build a church. But still, they don't have a lot of resources, so they joined with two other groups of Scandinavians to build a common church building. They were a Baptist group and a Methodist group and a Lutheran group, but all Scandinavians. They actually called it the Scandinavian Church Society. And that's the spelling that's in the records. To spell Scandinavia with a K is very unusual. It's normally a C. And whether that was a variant spelling coming out of the old country or whether it was just a mistake, we don't really know. You've maybe heard that any number of immigrants, for example, coming through Ellis Island, would be asked their name, they'd say it, and the agent would just write down phonetic spelling, and suddenly you had a different name than the one you brought over. So this could just be a phonetic spelling that is a variant on the way that it's normally spelled. But that's what it was called, the Scandinavian Church Society. This was a little church at 2nd Avenue and Franklin Street on the corner there. Some people have questioned whether this is the same building that is now St. John's Episcopal over by City Center. It is not. We know what happened to this church. It remained with the Methodists for a long time. With the Baptists for a long time, but then was eventually torn down. So each of these three groups had services once every third Sunday. So again, even with a church building, weekly worship is not really a possibility for them. And they still don't have full-time pastoral service either. Well, in 1895, so another decade plus, the Lutherans left this grouping to build their own church right here at 4th and Main. They built it on the same site where the current sanctuary is. We'll talk later about how they replaced that a few years later. But this was the original one. And this is a better picture of the church, but we just ran into this earlier this fall. And there you get, the church is over here on the edge, but you get a look down Main Street. And you can see, first of all, how lightly built up it is. And I think the picture is from about 1895, so right when the church was built. It's a funeral procession that's coming down Main Street there, heading toward Oakland, no doubt. But, not a whole lot of building up yet of Main Street, even 25 years after the town started. So I think it's hard to imagine what the place looked like years ago, when it was so much smaller than it is now. Well, at this point, the church had grown to 240 members, and they had 50 children in Sunday school. So it had become a going concern. And they needed, of course, their own place now, and so they built this church in 1895. Meanwhile, shortly thereafter, the Methodists broke away and built their own building, just a little ways down Franklin Street. And then some years after that, they merged into what is now Vineyard Methodist Church. The Baptists kept the building, the original one, that three-part building, that one, until they built their, what is now Cross Point Church. They built that building across from the school, renamed themselves Shalom, now Cross Point, and that's when this building then was no longer in use. Now, it's also curious, there is another one of these newspaper articles that Sharon tracked down, suggests that a group of Happy Danes were also using this building. And this is another one of these mysteries trying to untangle what the sources actually say, because our own records only ever refer to 3 groups using this building, one of which was clearly the Intermission Danes that formed Main Street Lutheran Church. So it's not clear if the Happy Danes were in fact a 4th group that made use of this building, or if the record just confused the two, which is entirely possible, trying to keep track of the Holy Danes from the Happy Danes and, who's who. It's entirely possible that they just got their wires crossed. And then, in fact, it was never the Happy Danes who shared this building. I don't know, and I'm not sure if it can be sorted out anymore at this point. What we do know is that eventually there was a group of Happy Danes here, and they built their own church. It was called Nazareth Danish Lutheran Church, and that was located at 1st Avenue Southeast and Jefferson Street. It would now be one corner of what is Veterans Park on the northeast side of downtown. Nazareth closed in 1943, and a number of their members merged into Main Street Lutheran at the time. Others went other places. And then the proceeds from that they had left, their assets that they left, they split between the Danish church denomination and Faith Lutheran. Faith got a $1,000 gift from Nazareth Lutheran when they closed in 1943. Well, that would have been a chunk of change at that time. That was a significant gift. Well, the fifth pastor to serve here, but the first one to reside here in Hutchinson, was a man named P. Nielsen. And I can't figure out or determine what the P stood for. It's just always P. Nielsen. And in fact, many of these, in this era, many adult men just went by their initials. You really have to dig deep to find the actual names. And if you're trying to study women of this era, it's even harder because most of them went by their husbands' names. My mother's mother was named Gunda, which is a great Norwegian name, but doesn't sound so good over here. And she hated that name, just hated her name Gunda. Well, her husband was Knut Olaf, but he always went by K.O., always used his initials. And so for all of her life, she was Mrs. K.O. Wagi. You know, and you needed to be an archaeologist to figure out that her name was actually Gunda. I mean, it just didn't appear. So anyhow, P. Nielsen, I'd love to know what the P stands for, but I don't as of now. One of the curious things is that the history says that he was paid semi-annually by the church. I mean, many of us get paid semi-weekly or bi-weekly, you know, and you're sort of waiting for the check to come into the account next time. Twice a year he got paid, and he had to provide his own housing. How he managed to keep food on the table, I have absolutely no idea. He did finally get permission from the church to go into St. Paul every third Sunday of the month and preach at Danish churches in the cities. May well have been due to the shortage of pastors, maybe needed to supplement his income. I'm not sure which it was. But so even though he resides in Hutchinson, still not a full-time pastor. They don't get that for quite a while yet. He was followed by a man named Lauritz Mathiasen. You notice he was only here a couple of years, maybe only a year and a half, roughly. But he is remembered in our records as having a really significant impact on the church. He was an effective pastor and leader of the congregation. In 1888, so shortly after he came here, he said, one of the pastors that followed him looked back and wrote that there was a general awakening that stirred the church. There was like a revival in the congregation. And this is very typical of the whole intermission movement. If you remember back when we described it, their focus was on doing evangelism within churches, to stir people up, to revive them in the faith, to get them, more jazzed and dedicated to the gospel. Well, it appears that's what happened when Mathiasen was here. There was a revival, a general awakening within the church. He was also instrumental in the short time he was here in starting St. Martin's Lutheran Church down in Heatwell. If you all know where that is, down on County Road 7. Morton, incidentally, M-O-R-T-E-N, is the Danish way to spell Martin, like Martin Luther. But it often appears around here, even in the little cast iron, wrought iron gate to their cemetery, as St. Morton's. But that's an anglicized spelling, the two O's. And it actually comes from a totally different root. Morton with two O's refers to the moors of northern England and Scotland. Martin, the German word, or Morten, the Danish word with an E at the end, refers to someone who's warlike, a soldier. So they look so much alike, they're totally different words. Totally different background between them. So even though you'll see the spelling with the two O's, that's not correct. That's an anglicizing of this Danish name. It was St. Morten's with an E there toward the end. Well, now, we zip down County Road 7 towards Stewart and don't even think twice about it. But in 1888, that was a long trip into town to come to church by horse and buggy. And there were enough Danes out there, they said, this is too much work, we want to start our own church. And so Mathiasen helped them to do that, and they got started then that year. But for their entire life, St. Morten's and Main Street Lutheran cooperated in ministry. Shared the pastor through all that time. They jointly built the first parsonage for the church here in Hutchinson in 1890 rather. At various times they had joint services, like especially during the summer when it was easier to travel. They would continue just to worship in Hutchinson instead. So it was always a kind of an adjunct, if you will, of Main Street Lutheran, even though it was technically a separate congregation. But as automobiles arrived, the need for this little country church down by Heatwell just quickly disappeared. And so by 1931, they dissolved. I think the actual ending started in 1928, because it says in the history that that's when Main Street Lutheran had a pastor all to themselves. And I think probably at that time, St. Morten's was on their own to find pastoral leadership. Tried to hang on, couldn't do it. And so in 1931, they said, all right, this is it. We're done. But as part of the dissolution of the congregation, Main Street Lutheran said, we'll maintain your building for 10 years and not just let it decay or be sold off. They actually kept it for 13. In 1944, the building was finally sold and moved off the site, apparently to be used as a chicken coop, which seems rather disrespectful, but that is what the record says. It also says in the history that the altar services, that's the phrase, were given to Trinity Seminary in Blair, Nebraska. Now, I don't know what services is a very odd word there. I don't know if that just means like the communion ware, offering plates, the service book, that kind of thing, or if the whole altar and the reredos in the back and all of that was given, all the furniture was given to Trinity Seminary. I do know when I was at Dana, they had the whole altar furniture that had been given by one of these little country churches. So when we did our annual Christmas concert, they would bring that out as the background, for the whole concert. It was absolutely gorgeous. So it may have been the whole business. I don't remember where that set came from. I don't think it was St. Morten's. So, anyhow, the other part of the agreement when St. Morten's dissolved was that Faith Lutheran would maintain their cemetery in perpetuity. And we do. And people like Dick go out there and mow the lawn to keep it looking nice, along with some others. If you've never been out there or stopped, it is a gorgeous sight. Just absolutely beautiful. Up on top of a little hill, and so I encourage you to do that sometime. If you go just past County Road 18 and hang a left on Tegas Avenue, it's right there, and it's just absolutely beautiful spot. It is, incidentally, the cemetery is closed to new burials, has been for a long time, because we suspect there are some unmarked graves out there. So you don't want to disturb the ground for fear that you're going to unearth a burial that isn't marked. If you haven't seen it yet, do stop down in the north entryway and look at the map and the display about St. Morten's. That was put together by Dave Jensen and his family a few years ago, and it's a lovely record of that spot and a little bit of the history. Well, as I noted earlier, when Main Street Lutheran started, or Hutchinson Danish Lutheran Church, it joined the Blair Church in 1885. It isn't clear whether the church ever formally joined the Norwegian Danish Conference. They got pastors from the conference to serve them, but there's nothing in our records that I've found that officially says they joined the conference at any time. If they didn't, that may explain why Faith Lutheran is not recognized, for example, by Paul Nyholm as one of the oldest churches, Danish churches in America. They just aren't in the records there. It does say that the first time Faith Lutheran sent a delegate to a synodical convention was after they joined the Blair Church. That was in 1888 that they finally did that. Another important pastor who served the church in these years was Hutchinson. You notice many of these tenure are very short. Very few of them serve for very long. He was here for about 4 years, might have been 5, there's a little ambiguity on the dates. But he was what today would be called a home mission pastor. He was all over the United States and Canada. And Paul Nyholm says that he probably founded more UELC churches than any other pastor. From scratch. Went into these community Danes and got them going, and then he moved on to another place. But while he was in Hutchinson, and this probably reflects his home mission gifts, the church grew significantly. It was a period of real flourishing. And so that's when that first church at 4th and Main was built. They couldn't fit in the little church on Franklin anymore. So it was while Hans Hansen was pastor here. He also served, actually, as the first president of the Blair Church. And once the United Church was formed in 1896, he was the first president of the Minnesota district of the United Church. So he was a very significant leader in a lot of ways. There were many pastors who served here in those early years, and again, a lot of them had very short tenures, so it gets to be a lot of names. And not a lot of information on most of them, but there are some really intriguing notes. One of my favorites is for this guy, Pastor A. Kierkegaard. Again, don't know what the A stands for. He served for a year and a half, June of 1890 to December of 1891. And in our history book, it says, his stay was rather brief in Hutchinson. He, quote, preached sin and grace and spared no one. Wouldn't you love to know more about that story? Wow. I'm thinking you had to wear your asbestos underwear to come to church when he got rolling, because it was fire and brimstone. And you look at him, you say, yep, yeah, he sort of looks not like a happy Dane at all. And another curious hint comes from Pastor Theo Beck, who served here from 1910 to 1915. By now, it's clearly known as Main Street Lutheran Church. You can see the dress is a little more modern there. But again, in our history book, it says, and this comes from older history, so it's really almost impossible to track down now what they knew or meant. But it says there were some trying times during these years. And then quotes Beck indirectly as saying, he never sought help in prayer at any other congregation he served as he did in Hutchinson. So apparently we were a troublesome lot here, a distinguished group of sinners who made life very difficult for him somehow or other. I don't know exactly what all the conflict was, but clearly it was not a good time for him. Now, all of these pastors served other churches, at least St. Morton's, up until 1928. That's the first time that Main Street Lutheran is recorded as having its own pastor to itself. Well, now, as we move into the 20th century, the church is getting very well established, but the world around it, of course, is changing very rapidly. And one of the most interesting examples of this comes in the history book, where they list 3 events in 3 years. In 1901, they finally put up some tying facilities for horses behind the church. I suppose before that they tied them to a tree branch or something, but they actually put up a little hitching post in the back. The next year, city water. You have running water in the church. And the year after that, electricity. So in the space of 3 years, you're going from a very primitive to a pretty darn modern situation, you know. This is how quickly the world is changing. And it affects the church, of course, too. World War I was also hugely significant for particularly immigrants and their churches. Up until then, many of them had maintained their language. But now with the World War and the kind of the jingoism of Americans going over to fight, not speaking English was suddenly looked on very suspiciously. This, of course, was very true for the German churches, because we were fighting Germany in World War I. But it also, I think, just kicked into gear a process that was going to happen regardless. I mean, you were not ever going to stop this. So some major changes grow out of or around World War I. In 1917, women were allowed to vote here at congregational meetings. Now, it might seem kind of late, but it's actually 3 years before the 19th Amendment passed, giving women the right to vote in the United States in governmental elections. In 1923, you had the very first worship services in English. It was every third Sunday morning, every last Sunday morning, and every Sunday evening. Still had 2 services every Sunday. So all the evening services were in English. Last Sunday of the month in the morning, it was in English. But then the English just took over very rapidly. And the last Danish service, was held in the end of May 1935. And it was all English after that. Well, part of this, of course, is driven by the fact that the lines of the immigrant communities are really starting to disappear. And this sense of being in these ethnic enclaves is just breaking down, because people are living cheek by jowl with people from all over the world. They're intermarrying, they're doing business, and it's all in English, so this sense of ethnic identity is really starting to change. Pastor J.T.H. Lund served here for quite a while, actually, 12 years, up until 1928. But again, in our 125th anniversary booklet, it says, at the close of his ministry in Hutchinson, the congregation was practically an all English-speaking congregation, ready to receive into its membership any nationality. Now, I think we hear that and say, well, why wouldn't accept any nationality? I mean, good grief, what's the big deal? But we have to remember that the immigrant churches generally understood their mission was to serve their own people in their own language. There actually, years and years ago, I read an account of a circuit riding minister who would come into any town in the Midwest, and say, any Danes here? Any Norwegians here? The answer was no. He'd keep riding. You're not my people. I'm not interested in you. So this sense of this is our church for our people in our language was very, very strong. And so the idea of, we'll take anybody. We'll even take Swedes. It's just, this is a major change in mindset. It is very, very significant. And so to be Danish Americans rather than Danes in America was a really big leap. To think of themselves as Danish Americans rather than Danes living in America. Seems minor, but it wasn't. It was a huge step for them. And this really marked the start. It's kind of artificial. But in some ways, you can mark 1928 as the start of the modern era of Main Street Lutheran Church. And a lot of the things that we take for granted as a part of church life only now start to come into the practice and the life of the church. So it led to all sorts of important developments. Sadly, it also led eventually to kind of the eclipse of the church's heritage and identity, where they become just American, not even Danish American anymore. And there were some good things and some bad things that are a part of that. But that's where we'll pick up the story next week.
You have called to us the